I didn't expect silence to have a weight, but the first night I moved in, it sat on my shoulders like an old coat, familiar, but heavy in all the wrong places. The house wasn't mine, not really. Just the guest house on the edge of her estate. A narrow path separated my door from hers. And in the middle of that path, just beyond the kitchen window, I saw her, standing there, in the rain, barefoot. No umbrella. No urgency. Just a stillness that made me freeze mid-step with the last box in my hands. She didn't move. She didn't flinch at the thunder grumbling somewhere in the distance. She looked up once, toward the sky, or maybe toward something I couldn't see, and then closed her eyes. I watched her too long. It wasn't curiosity, not even concern. It was the way she made the rain look like company. The woman I'd been told to assist was named Eleanor. 70, widowed, lived alone in a big house that felt like it hadn't exhaled in decades. People in town called her eccentric, reclusive, strange, but no one said she was cruel, just distant. Like grief had set a table in her home and never left. I hadn't spoken to her yet, just received a note when I arrived. Kitchen stocked, keys under mat. We don't speak at night. Welcome. It was signed with an E. No flourish, no warmth. Still, it was more welcome than I'd gotten from my own parents the day I left home. They called it quitting. I called it starting over. I used to study law. Spent 4 years trying to chase a version of myself that my father respected but I never recognized. When I finally stopped pretending, the silence between us became a wall. So I left. Took what little savings I had and responded to a job listing that felt more like a riddle than an offer. Live-in assistant. Quiet required. Good with time and tools. Garden knowledge a plus. Turns out the ad was for Eleanor. And this? This was my first night. A mattress on the floor, damp edges from a window that didn't close all the way. No curtains, just wooden, blinds that creaked with every breeze. I stood at the window, watching her, still unmoving, her nightdress clinging to her knees. The rain softened for a moment, then picked up again like it forgot it had someplace to be. I should have looked away, but she didn't seem to mind the eyes, or maybe she didn't feel them at all anymore. When she finally turned and walked toward her porch, it wasn't hurried, just resigned, like she was returning to something unfinished. The next morning, I walked the small path to the main house. Wet leaves stuck to my shoes. The garden was wild but tended, roses growing alongside weeds like no one had the heart to separate them. There was a small pair of clippers lying on the bench, rusted at the hinge but still useful. I wondered when she last used them. She opened the door before I could knock. No makeup, no expression, just soft, silver hair braided down her back and eyes that didn't blink enough. "You're early," she said. I looked at my watch. It was 8:04. "I can come back later." She stared for a second, then stepped aside. I walked in. The air smelled like old pages and candle wax, even though there were no candles burning. Just a single lamp on the far side of the room, and an antique clock on the wall that ticked a second too slow. Everything was still. Her voice broke the quiet, not harshly, just enough. "Don't speak unless it matters. I don't do filler words." I nodded. We sat at the small wooden table by the window. She placed 2 cups down, one in front of me, one untouched before her. There was sugar on the tray, a small silver spoon, even a pitcher of cream. But she didn't use any, just lifted the cup, held it to her lips, and didn't drink. "I saw you last night," I said quietly. She didn't look at me. "In the rain," I added, a pause. Then, "Rain's the only thing that doesn't ask questions." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. She finally took a sip. I noticed her hands were elegant, lined but steady. The kind that had done work, but gentle work. Planting, sowing, maybe writing things she never sent. "You'll take care of the garden," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. "There's a room you don't go into. Top of the stairs, left door. Leave it shut." I nodded again, and then silence. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just settled. Like we both agreed not to fill it. The clock kept ticking behind us, offbeat and tired, but the room didn't mind. After a while, she looked out the window and whispered something I barely heard. "You remind me of someone." I didn't ask who, because I could tell. By the way, her gaze drifted to the wet grass and didn't come back. That the answer wasn't mine to hold yet. When I returned to the guest house that night, the air smelled like lavender and soil. I left my shoes by the door, sat on the mattress, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere a bird cried out and flew too close to the window, and I wrote down one thing in my journal before sleeping. She was standing in the rain like she wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. And somehow, that made me stay. It took me a few days to understand how Eleanor moved through a room. She didn't walk like people do when they're headed somewhere. She moved like memory. Soft, deliberate. Quiet enough that you questioned whether she'd ever been there at all. That morning, I decided to make tea before she came down. I wasn't sure if that was part of the job, but the silence in her kitchen begged to be filled gently, and this felt like the least intrusive way. I found the old kettle, dented near the handle, and boiled water like it was something sacred. The tea was loose leaf, jasmine, earthy and floral. I added 1 spoon of sugar. Out of habit, I set it down on the table. She entered without sound, her eyes landed on the cup, then on me. She sat down, hands folded neatly in her lap. Steam curled upward between us. She lifted the cup, sipped once, barely, and set it back down. Then she said something so quiet it could have been mistaken for breath. "I don't take sugar." I felt a flash of heat in my neck. "I'm sorry. Just instinct." She didn't answer, but her fingers tapped once against the ceramic rim before going still again. Not angry, just aware. We sat like that, the sugar slowly dissolving at the bottom of her untouched cup. A clock ticked from the hallway, somewhere deep in the house. It echoed strangely, like the walls hadn't been spoken to in years. She looked at me, not with reproach, more like inspection. "You think kindness is in the gesture," she said. "But it's in the remembering." I nodded. Or at least tried, to. In truth, I was still learning how to live in a space without needing to be useful all the time. I used to perform value, be loud about effort, compensate with energy. But here, effort was invisible. Quiet. Like sweeping a room no one entered, just because it felt right. Later that afternoon, I went to the study to dust the bookshelves. She wasn't there. The room was large, sun-warmed, filled with framed photographs that hadn't moved in decades. One caught my eye. Eleanor, maybe in her early 20s, laughing mid-motion, her hand wrapped around the wrist of a man who wasn't smiling but looked content in the way people do when they've stopped pretending. I didn't realize she'd come in behind me. "You found the girl I used to be," she said softly. I turned. She wasn't looking at the photo. She was looking at the window beside it, where the sun touched the curtains and made them glow like old parchment. "You looked happy," I offered. "I was someone then," she replied. "Not just a name on bills and old letters." Her voice didn't crack. It didn't ache. It simply landed. There was a teacup on her desk, cold, half full, no sugar. "I never liked sweetness," she added, "even when it was offered with good hands." I didn't know what to say, again, so I didn't. Instead, I walked over to the window, not too close, and let the light warm my palms. She stayed by the doorway, watching, breathing slowly. Something in the room felt paused, like it had been holding its breath for years, and was only just remembering how to let go. That evening, I returned to the guest house and made myself tea. No sugar. I sat at the small table with the lamp flickering, and wrote down, "There's a kind of grace in people who teach you how to be still, without making you feel forgotten." And as the night deepened and the air cooled, I thought about the sugar at the bottom of her cup, about the words she didn't say, about the way she held silence like a second skin. Not everyone wants to be healed. Some just want to be seen, exactly as they are. And maybe for the first time in a long time, I was learning how to see. Mornings began to carry a rhythm I hadn't known I needed. Not the noise of alarms or notifications, but the softness of movement. Leaves brushing the porch rail, water bubbling in the kettle, the low creak of Eleanor's chair shifting slightly before she ever spoke. She always got up, before I did. The first time I joined her on the porch, I didn't ask permission. I just brought my tea, left the sugar behind, and sat 2 steps down from her chair, not beside her, but close enough that silence didn't feel like distance. The porch looked out on a garden that had once known discipline, but now grew on memory alone. Wild roses tangled with old vines. A chipped birdbath stood in the corner, half filled with last night's rain. Ivy crawled like it had forgotten to ask. Eleanor held her cup close, not drinking, just holding, like it was a weight she chose. Each day. "You see that column?" she said, pointing toward the far right edge of the porch. I nodded. It was wrapped in faded white paint and a little bit of moss. "There used to be a nest in that crack," she continued. "A robin, every spring. Same one, I think. Always came back." What happened to it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sipped her tea, finally, and looked past the garden, past the birdbath, past anything I could see. "The year he died," she whispered. "It didn't come back." She didn't say who he was. She didn't need to. The way her eyes fixed on the empty space made it clear. It wasn't about birds. It never was. She looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of years that didn't have names anymore. I wanted to ask something, maybe who he was, maybe what she missed, but the moment felt too holy for questions. Instead, I reached down and brushed away a leaf from the porch step. The act didn't mean anything, but her eyes caught it, and she softened, just a little, like the first sign of spring after a long, proud winter. We sat like that for a while. No words, just the gentle sound of wind moving through dry trees and the occasional rustle of something living that didn't want to be seen. After she went back inside, I stayed. Watched the garden. Listened to the way the house settled around itself. There was a note tucked under my mug when I finally stood up. Folded neatly, written in blue ink, shaky but intentional. "We don't need to talk to be understood." I read it twice. Back at the guest house, I placed the note on my desk, laid it flat, like something sacred. I didn't know what I was becoming in that place. Not a guest, not a worker. Maybe not anything you could name in one word. But I felt seen, and that night I wrote, "Some birds return, others leave when the porch grows cold. But some of us, we stay, even when we don't know why yet." I didn't grow up around gardens. My father had a lawn that was mowed with precision and never walked on. My mother kept plastic flowers in vases she never dusted. The only thing I ever planted was a lie about being happy. But Eleanor, she touched plants like they were people. One morning, I found her kneeling in the soil just beyond the porch, wearing thick gloves and an old sun hat that shaded her eyes but not her sharpness. She didn't call me over, just kept pruning, softly, intentionally, like she was apologizing to the thorns. "Come here," she finally said, without looking up. I obeyed. She took off one glove and handed me a pair of clippers. Held them out like something fragile. "You don't cut with anger. You cut with care, always." I knelt beside her. She guided my hands without touching them, told me to trim the dead petals first, then the stems that leaned too far from the rest. "Not because they're wrong," she said, "but because they're lonely." I didn't speak. Neither did she for a while. Only when we reached the rose bush did she pause and remove her other glove. Her fingers were pale but strong. She showed me where to cut, right above the third leaf node, and told me, "That's where growth forgives you." I don't think she was talking about the rose. After an hour, I was sweating. Dirt under my nails, knees sore from crouching. She stood up slowly, wiped her hands on a towel that had seen better days, and said, "You didn't hurt them." I looked at the scattered petals on the ground. "They're still here," she added. "They're just not blooming now." I carried the cuttings to the compost. She stayed behind. Inside her study later that day, I dusted the lower shelves while she sat at her desk, writing in a notebook she always closed when I entered. Her handwriting was neat, slanted, like the kind people used when letters mattered. There were photos behind her, framed in wood, faded at the edges. One caught my eye again. The young version of Eleanor laughing, full of sunlight, her arms around a man I hadn't seen before. He looked like he wasn't ready to be in love but had fallen anyway. "You looked happy in that one," I said. She didn't turn around. "I was someone then," she replied, her voice quiet but not weak. "Not just a woman people whisper about, not just a name on deeds and prescriptions." There was a pause. "You're still someone," I whispered. She didn't respond, but she didn't disagree either. Instead, she picked up her tea, sipped, once, and looked out the window toward the garden. That evening, I brought in a single rose from the bush we'd worked on. I placed it in a chipped vase and set it on the windowsill of the guest house. Its petals drooped slightly, but to me, it felt like proof that something had bloomed again. I sat at my desk, opened my notebook, and wrote. She showed me how to hold a rose without hurting it. Maybe one day I'll learn how to do the same with people. The power went out on a Tuesday evening. No storm, no warning, just silence. The kind that presses against your ears, thick and sudden, as if even the air is unsure what comes next. I had just finished folding some laundry, soft shirts, clean sheets still warm from the dryer. When the lights blinked and vanished, I lit one of the candles Eleanor had given me last week, lavender and cedar. The flame shimmered just enough to feel like company. I stepped out and walked toward the main house. Her porch light was off. But through the window I saw movement, a flicker of gold across her walls. Candlelight. I knocked gently. She opened, the door slowly, holding a brass candlestick like it was part of her hand. No questions. She just stepped aside and let me in. The room felt older in the dark. Shadows stretched across bookshelves like memories reaching out. A breeze slipped through the slightly cracked window. Somewhere, a clock still ticked. Battery-powered, steady, stubborn. "Tea?" she asked, already moving toward the kettle. I nodded. She prepared it by feel, no measuring, no fuss. 2 cups, no sugar. We sat at the table again, now lit only by a single candle between us. The flame danced softly, reflecting in her eyes, catching in the lines of her face like secrets folded carefully over time. It felt like a moment borrowed from another life. Then, out of nowhere, she told a joke. Something unexpected. Something with an edge, a wickedness, a punchline about a priest and a misdelivered letter that made no real sense. I laughed too hard. Laughed because it didn't fit. Laughed because I needed the release. Laughed because she didn't. She just watched me, smiling faintly, but saying nothing else. And in that silence, something deeper passed between us. Not regret. Not shame. But a kind of knowing. I quieted. She sipped her tea and leaned back, the candlelight tracing the shape of her profile. "People always expect the quiet ones to be sad," she said eventually. "But sometimes we're just tired of explaining ourselves to loud rooms." That sentence didn't feel like it was meant to impress me. It felt like something she'd whispered to herself 1,000 times. And tonight, it simply slipped out. I didn't reply. Instead, I watched the candle melt slightly, its wax pooling like memories do. Slow and inevitable. Later that night, I returned to the guest house, the air outside heavy with stillness. The lights didn't come back on, but the darkness no longer felt like absence. It felt like a pause. At my desk, I lit another candle, not for light, just for presence. And I wrote. The candlelight flickered, but her silence said more than her joke. And maybe that's the kind of language I've needed all along. It was a Thursday when she handed me the box. No ceremony, no note. Just a small square box wrapped in linen and placed silently beside my tea that morning. I looked at her, confused. She didn't meet my eyes, just lifted her own cup, took a long sip, and said, "Open it." Inside was a gold wristwatch. The face was scratched slightly, the leather strap aged and worn, but the hands gleamed under the morning light like they were still trying to be something new. It doesn't keep time anymore, she said softly. Stopped years ago. Why give it to me then? She finally looked at me. Because it was meant for someone who stayed. I didn't know what to say. My fingers rested over the glass, cold to the touch. I hadn't worn a watch in years, and yet this one suddenly felt heavier than it looked. Like it carried years that weren't mine. I placed it gently on my wrist. It didn't tick. But somehow it didn't feel broken. That afternoon, I cooked dinner. I didn't ask what she liked. I didn't ask if she was hungry. I just did it. Boiled pasta, cut fresh tomatoes, added rosemary from the edge of her garden. The kitchen smelled like something familiar, like a home you'd only visited once but remembered forever. She didn't speak when I served it, just sat, fork in hand, slowly twirling noodles onto her plate. We ate quietly, and in that quiet, something settled between us. Not comfort, not yet, but a rhythm. After the dishes were cleared and the candle was snuffed, she stood in the hallway for a moment, watching me gather my things. You don't owe me anything, she said. I looked up. I know, I whispered. But I think I'm still learning how to stay. She nodded once, then turned and walked into the shadows of the house, her footsteps soft against the old wooden floor. Back in the guest house, I took the watch off my wrist and placed it on the table. It reflected the light from the lamp in a way that made the hands seem like they were moving again, even if only in memory. I sat with it for a while, not watching it, just letting it sit there. Existing like her. Like me. Alive. But still catching up with time. I wrote that night. She gave me a watch that didn't keep time, but somehow it reminded me to slow down, to sit still, to listen without waiting for the next moment. And maybe that's what it means to belong somewhere. It came in the morning mail, a pale cream envelope, thick and soft at the edges, with Eleanor's name written in looping cursive. The kind of handwriting that people don't use anymore. The kind that belongs to memories. I found it on the hallway, table beside the bowl where she kept keys that never unlocked anything I'd seen. She stared at it for a long time before picking it up. Didn't open it. Didn't even read the return address. Just held it, then placed it on the mantel without a word. The day moved slowly after that. She didn't ask me to prune the garden. Didn't mention the tea. Just wandered from one room to another like she was waiting for something to surface inside. Her. Something she hadn't invited but knew was coming. That evening, I walked past the living room and saw her standing over the fireplace, that same envelope in her hand. The flames were low, controlled. She stared into them, unmoving. And then, quietly, without looking back, she fed the envelope to the fire. It curled, folded in on itself, turned black, and vanished into smoke. I didn't ask her why, but something in me tightened. The next morning, the house was colder, not in temperature, but in spirit. Her steps were slower, her eyes distant. She made tea but left it untouched. The steam rose and disappeared before she even lifted the cup. We sat across from each other, the candle between us now only half its size. I thought it was over, she whispered, almost to herself. That grief had already taken what it wanted. I said nothing. Then something small arrives. A letter. And suddenly, the ache is new again. She didn't need to explain further. I could feel it, like the echo of a storm that had already passed, but left the ground soft and dangerous. Later that afternoon, I cleaned the study. She was upstairs, lying on the daybed she never used before. The watch she gave me rested on my wrist, silent but familiar. I opened the window a little to let the breeze in. The air smelled like ash and roses. I found a small scrap of the burned envelope on the hearth, half hidden under the grate. It wasn't much. Just part of a name. 3 letters in a swirl of ink. But it felt like a piece of her she tried to erase. I didn't keep it, didn't throw it away either. I placed it on the table beside the cold teacup, and walked out quietly. That night, the wind howled louder than usual. The trees bent under the weight of it. I lay on my mattress in the guest house, eyes open, listening to the creaks and sighs of a house that had held too many stories for too long. I thought about that envelope, about how something so small could carry years of silence, about how fire can destroy paper, but never what was written inside you. I picked up my journal and wrote. She burned the letter, but not what it brought back. Some grief doesn't ask permission to return. It just knocks, softly, then all at once. It was early, the kind of morning where the light is soft enough to believe in second chances, but the floor is cold and every step reminds you you're still in this world. I came by with the intention to check the rose vines. A few of the stems had begun to wilt at the edges, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it would matter to her if someone noticed. I didn't knock. That wasn't something she required anymore. Our rhythm had changed. Some days she greeted me with a word. Other days, only with the way she set my cup slightly closer to the edge of the table. Presence had become enough. But that morning, I walked in and paused. She was in the living room. Not sitting, not reading, but speaking. Low, quiet, rhythmic, like prayer or memory. I almost called out, thought maybe she hadn't heard me, but then I saw who she was facing. A chair, an old armchair, faded green, placed in a way I hadn't noticed before. Tilted slightly toward the window. A blanket draped across the arm. One of her old shawls. I froze. She didn't see me, or maybe she did, and just didn't want me to interrupt. I stayed in the hallway, listening, not to eavesdrop, but to witness. Her voice was soft, filled with a kind of love I hadn't heard from her yet. She spoke of the garden, of the robin that still hadn't returned, of the letter, of how it didn't break her, but reminded her she could still bend. She paused often, as if waiting for someone to answer, as if someone might. I stood there until the kettle whistled behind me, sharp and sudden. She turned. Her eyes met mine. No surprise, no apology, just quiet acknowledgement. I lowered my gaze. Sorry, I didn't mean to. She nodded once. I know. We didn't speak of it again. But later that day, while she arranged dried lavender in a bowl near the study window, she said, "He used to sit in that chair every evening, always with the window cracked just enough to hear the world." I listened. "He died in that chair," she added, not to shock me, just because it was true. She wiped her hands on her apron. He was supposed to grow old, not me, alone. And for the first time, I realized she wasn't hiding from the world. She was simply learning how to live, without the parts that made it feel full. That afternoon, I sat beside the birdbath and watched the sky. A single leaf floated in the water, brown at the edges, still holding on. I thought about love, how it doesn't always leave when the person does, how it lingers, in voices, in chairs, in silence that feels like conversation. That night, I lit a candle without needing a reason. The watch sat beside it, gleaming faintly, and I wrote. I found her talking to someone who wasn't there anymore, and somehow I understood every word. There's a certain quiet that follows vulnerability, not silence, but something heavier, something thoughtful. It filled the air between us after that morning. She didn't close the door to the living room anymore. The chair stayed tilted, the shawl untouched. Sometimes I'd see her glance toward it like she was still waiting for him to say something. Just one more thing. That evening, I found her in the kitchen, slicing apples. The light was low, golden, coming through the window like it was trying not to disturb us. She handed me a piece without looking up. I leaned against the counter and chewed slowly. Out of nowhere, she said, "He never proposed to me." I stopped mid-bite. "I did," she added, "on the day he was packing to leave." I didn't know how to respond. She placed the knife down, gently, like it had done something wrong. He was leaving for a job. Said we weren't right anymore. Said I'd be better off with someone predictable. Someone who didn't make promises with tired hands. Her eyes flickered to the floor. So I asked him to stay. Not because I knew it would work, but because sometimes you have to choose someone before they run. There was no bitterness in her voice. Just a quiet sort of understanding that only comes with age and ache. "I wasn't his first choice either," she added, almost as an afterthought. He once told me that. But he stayed, and in the end, that mattered more. She looked at me then, fully, softly, and I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. She saw me. Not just the version of me that brewed her tea or pruned her garden, but the parts I'd kept hidden even from myself. The parts that still wondered if love had an expiration date. If being enough meant being chosen first. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the foot of my mattress, the golden wristwatch cold, against my wrist, ticking in memory, if not in motion. I thought about what it means to not be someone's first love, or second, or even a name they expected to remember, and yet, still show up. Still sit beside them when the room is heavy with everything they lost. Still stay. The next morning she made tea before I could. Set it on the table, no sugar. When I sat down she didn't speak, just slid a plate of toast across the table with a slice of butter so thin it was nearly invisible. And it felt like a gesture that had nothing to prove, as if to say, you're not replacing anyone. But you're not nothing either. I looked at the tea, steam curling upward, catching the light just right, and I wrote that evening. I wasn't her first choice, but I was still there, and sometimes that's what love becomes, when the people who weren't part of the plan stay anyway. Small towns are made of stories, some true, some stretched, but all of them whispered loud enough to leave a mark. I first heard it while buying oranges from the corner grocer. Two women stood by the shelf of canned beans, leaning a little too close, their voices hushed just enough to pretend they weren't performing. The old widow and her young boy toy, one of them said. The other laughed, sharp and quick like breaking glass. Maybe she's buying his company, or maybe he just likes her money. I didn't say anything. I just stood still behind the produce rack, holding a bag of fruit like it was the last thing tying me to the moment. I walked home slower than usual. The gravel felt louder under my shoes. My hands stayed buried in my pockets. I kept thinking about their faces, how certain they sounded, how easy it was for them to make her small, make us a spectacle. When I got back, Eleanor was sitting on the porch, same cup, same chair, her eyes on the garden, but distant, like she had left her thoughts somewhere far behind. I sat down beside her, this time on the same level, not 2 steps down. There's talk, I said quietly. I know, her voice didn't waver. Does it bother you? She took a long sip of tea, then set the cup down. No. But she didn't look at me, and her hands were trembling, just slightly. Not from age, not from cold, from memory, from what words could still do, even now. I watched her, for a while, the way she smoothed the edge of her shawl, the way she blinked just once too slow, the way she tilted her face away from mine, like light hurt a little more than it used to. So I didn't ask again, because the answer was in the silence, and in the way the light had gone out from her eyes without her noticing. That night I made dinner. Left it at her door without knocking. A note tucked underneath. You are not a punchline. She didn't mention it the next morning, but the plate was clean. The note folded and placed on the table, weighed down by her teacup. The town kept whispering. People stared a little longer when we walked to the corner store together. Children asked their parents questions in voices too loud to be innocent, and yet, she kept walking, head held high, steps even, back straight. But her laughter, it came less often, and when it did, she closed her eyes, as if the joy was safer, when she didn't have to see the world watching her have it. That night, I sat on my porch alone. The lamp beside me flickered. The gold watch on my wrist caught the last edge of sunset. A breeze passed through the trees, quiet and tired. I thought about what it means to be misunderstood, to be judged for the shape of something people can't name, to be seen and still be made invisible by people who never stayed long enough to understand you. And I wrote. They spoke like we were a joke. And she laughed with her eyes closed, because sometimes even joy has to hide to survive. She gave me the key without a word. It was late afternoon. The sun was slanting across the floor, lighting only the edge of her slippers. She walked past me in the hallway, paused, reached into the drawer near the stairs, and placed the small bronze key in my hand. "You'll know. Which door?" That was it. She didn't wait for my reaction, didn't follow me, just turned and disappeared into the quiet. I stood there for a long time, feeling the shape of the key in my palm. Cold metal, slightly bent at the edge, worn where fingers had pressed too hard too often. I'd walked past the door dozens of times. Top of the stairs, left side, always closed, always untouched. The kind of door that doesn't creak when you open it, because even the hinges have learned silence. When I stepped in, the smell hit me first. Dust, lavender, something softer. Linen, maybe, or time itself. The air was still, heavy, like it had been waiting for breath. The room was small, pale yellow walls. A crib, too small for anything but memory. A rocking horse, gently tilted. Books stacked on a shelf labeled 3+. One sock on the edge of a faded armchair, too tiny for anyone alive. A nursery, but untouched. Untouched in a way that didn't feel preserved. It felt paused. The curtains hadn't moved in years, but the light still knew how to find its way in. I didn't cross the room. I didn't sit. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, barely breathing. It was a room for someone who never came back. And suddenly, all the small silences made sense. The way she looked at birds, the way she sat with shadows, the way she never asked me to be anything more than quiet. I turned to leave, but before I stepped out, I noticed something on the wall. A frame, simple wood, scratched at the edges. Inside it, a child's drawing, crayons, messy lines, a house, a woman, a stick figure holding hands with both. The caption said, "My home." I closed the door behind me as gently as I could. Walked downstairs. She was sitting in the garden, trimming dead petals from the rose bushes. She didn't look up when I approached, just said, "I stopped aging the day he died." I sat beside her. The shears paused in her hand. "But you," she continued, "you make time move again." There were no tears in her voice, no tremble, just release. Like something long trapped had finally stretched its legs. We didn't speak again that evening. I stayed in the garden after. She went inside, listening to the way the wind moved through the roses. Even they looked tired. That night, back in the guest house, I took the key from my pocket and placed it on the table beside the gold watch. Both of them, silent. Both of them, holding time in different ways. I sat at my desk, opened my journal, and wrote. The room smelled like time forgot to pass. But grief remembers everything, even when the world tries to forget. The storm came suddenly. Not loud, but steady. The kind of rain that doesn't shout, just stays. Like it plans to linger, soak into everything, remind you of what can't be fixed with sunshine. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it, holding a bottle of wine and 2 chipped glasses. Eleanor was already there, wrapped in her shawl, her hair braided and resting gently on one shoulder. She didn't speak. I poured slowly. The first clap of thunder came while I was still settling into the chair across from her. She didn't flinch, just closed her eyes for a moment, like thunder was an old companion. We sat in silence, our glasses resting on the small table between us, rain tapping gently on the tin roof. After a while, I asked, "Have you ever loved someone who doesn't make sense?" She turned her face toward me. The candle between us flickered once, like it wanted to listen too. Her voice was almost a whisper. "I'm starting to." The words drifted across the table like steam from her tea. Barely there, but warm enough to feel. I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I didn't know what to do with the ache in my chest that followed. So I stood up, said nothing, and walked back into the rain, not because I wanted to leave, but because staying would have meant admitting that I felt it too. Inside the guest house, I sat on the floor beside my mattress. The room felt colder than usual. The light from the candle didn't reach the corners. I kept hearing her voice again and again. I'm starting to. Like love could begin at 70. Like presence could be enough. Like maybe the heart doesn't ask for permission. It just recognizes what it's been waiting for. But I was afraid. Afraid of what it meant to love someone with a past that big, a silence that old. Afraid of the eyes watching us from town windows, from porch steps, from behind coffee shop curtains. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of not being enough. The rain kept falling, soft, steady, insistent. The gold watch on my wrist didn't move, but something inside me did. A quiet shift, a question I couldn't answer yet. Later that night, I opened my journal and wrote. The rain tapped like a question neither of us could answer. But maybe, not all questions need to be answered to be felt. Eleanor fell sick just as spring arrived. The garden had begun to bloom again, new buds pushing through tired stems, robins returning to rooftops, but inside the house, something was fading. It wasn't sudden, just quieter than usual. Slower steps, half-drunk tea, a forgotten name left hanging mid-sentence. I drove her to the hospital the morning she couldn't stand without resting twice between the bed and the door. She didn't complain. Not once. She just looked out the car window and said, "I've always hated hospitals. Everything smells like waiting." 3 days passed. Tests. Soft voices. Machines that beeped like they were uncertain too. When I came to visit on the 4th day, she was sitting up, pale, thinner, but watching the rain streak down the window with eyes that still knew what they'd seen. She asked me to sit. I did. Then she said it. So gently, I almost missed it. "I need you to marry me." I didn't move. She reached for the glass of water on the tray, took a sip, and placed it back exactly where it had been. "It's not for love," she said, her eyes never leaving the rain. "It's for the house, the estate. If I go, they'll take it, auction it, break it, into parts I won't be here to keep whole." I swallowed hard. My throat was dry. "I don't expect you to say yes for romance. I just want it all to stay. As it is." I nodded. But something in my chest cracked anyway. Because I knew, deep down, that this was love. Not the kind you write poems about, but the kind you agree to with steady hands and quiet resolve. We signed the papers at the courthouse. No rings, no guests. Just 2 names on a line and a clerk who didn't look up. When the judge asked, "Do you take her?" I said yes. Not because I had to, but because I already had. After the signature dried, she smiled for the first time in days. Not wide. Just soft. Like something inside her had exhaled. That night, she was too tired to sit on the porch. So I sat alone. The candle beside me flickered, in the wind. Her shawl still draped across the empty chair. I held her teacup. It was still warm, and I wrote. She didn't ask for love. Just someone who wouldn't leave first. And maybe that's what love really is. The choice to stay when staying isn't beautiful, just real. She passed quietly. No final words, no dramatic moments. Just a slow hush, like the house itself had prepared for it. Had known all along. The nurse called me early in the morning. I don't remember the drive. I don't remember the hallway, or the way the sheets were folded over her hands. I just remember her face. Still. At peace. As if she'd finally caught up to the time her grief had kept frozen for decades. There was a sealed envelope on the nightstand. My name on the front. I took it with shaking hands. I didn't open it there. I didn't want that moment to belong to anyone else, not even the walls of the hospital. When I got home, I made tea, no sugar. Set it beside the candle she used to light on stormy nights. And I opened the letter. Her handwriting had softened since the grocery lists and garden notes. It was less precise now, more fluid, like her words had waited long enough and no longer needed to be perfect. I loved twice in my life. Once in my youth, with all the wild hunger of someone who doesn't know how rare it is. And once when I knew I wouldn't be loved back the same way. But I was loved truly. My throat tightened. You gave me time again. Not years. Not youth. But moments that made the silence less loud. I didn't marry you because I was dying. I married you because you didn't ask me to prove I was still someone worth staying for. The letter ended simply. Thank you for not leaving. You are my last home. I didn't cry when she passed, but I cried then, quietly, without shame. Because grief doesn't always arrive on the day of the goodbye. Sometimes it hides in the kindness of being chosen. The lawyer came the next week. He read the will in a voice too rehearsed. No pause where it mattered. No softness in the parts that should have landed with silence. She left me everything. The guest house, the main house, the garden, her teacups, her books, her chair, except for one room. The nursery. In her own handwriting, next to that part of the document, it read, "Let it stay untouched. It is not meant to be filled again, only remembered." I signed where he pointed, and when he left, I walked through the house alone. Each step felt like a page being turned. Every window held a different memory. The clock still ticked unevenly. Her shawl was still draped over the chair. Nothing had moved, and yet, everything had changed. That night, I sat on the porch with her candle, her cup, and the gold watch she gave me. It still didn't tick, but I wore it anyway. I didn't feel like a husband. I didn't feel like a widow. I felt like someone who had been seen. And maybe that was the only thing I had ever needed. I opened my journal and wrote. The will didn't speak loud, but her letter did. And in her words, I found the only vow that ever truly mattered. Thank you for not leaving. Spring came quietly. No grand announcements, just the steady unfurling of petals, the soft return of birdsong, and the way the light warmed the porch again without asking permission. I sat there most mornings, tea in hand, gold watch on my wrist, still silent, and yet nothing in me felt still. The garden had begun to breathe again. The robins had returned to the columns. One even nested near the place she once pointed to, the spot where memory had stopped blooming for her. I smiled when I saw it. Inside, the house hadn't changed much. I dusted, watered her plants, made tea in her cup, even when it was just for me. The nursery door stayed closed. I never touched it. Never needed to. Because some spaces aren't meant to hold people again. Only love. One morning, as I watched the sun trace the porch railing, I heard a small voice call from inside. Uncle? It was my sister's daughter. She was staying for the weekend. Her first visit since everything changed. She had her mother's eyes and Eleanor's curiosity. I turned, smiled. In the kitchen, I called back. She appeared in the doorway holding a small drawing. 3 figures holding hands beneath a tree. A house behind them with the word home scrawled across the roof in crayon. I drew this for you, she said. Took it gently, kneeling to her level. Is that you? I asked, pointing. She nodded. And who's this? She tapped the smallest figure. That's me. And her? I pointed to the woman in the middle. She paused, then whispered, She looks like someone who lives here. I couldn't speak. Instead, I wrapped her in a hug and said, She did. Later that evening, I placed the drawing on the mantel beside Eleanor's letter, not framed, just resting, like it belonged. We had dinner on the porch, lemon chicken, fresh bread, tea for me, juice for her. She asked questions about the garden, about Eleanor's books, about why the big chair always had a shawl on it. I answered the best I could. Simple. Honest. When she fell asleep that night, curled on the guest house couch beneath one of Eleanor's old quilts, I sat beside her and listened to the wind brushing against the windows, and I said softly, she wasn't waiting to be saved. She was waiting to be seen. The next morning, I added a new shelf to the hallway. Hung a wooden sign above it. Something real. It's what we used to call the shop she never opened, the dream she left unspoken. Now it holds her candles, and the watch, and the key she gave me to everything that mattered. I never remarried. Never felt the need to. Because what we had wasn't about filling a role. It was about staying long enough for silence to become belonging. Years later, a boy asked me at the market stall, Are you married? I smiled. I was. To who? I looked out toward the field where the robins still returned each spring. To someone who never needed to be rescued, I said. Just remembered. That night, I sat on the porch again, candle lit, cup warm in my hands. And I wrote the final words in my journal. I didn't marry her to gain anything. I married her to understand what it means to stay.